Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Abbotoy and Timon, Cline. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the American Reformer Podcast. Usual host here, Timon Cline, Editor-in-Chief of American Reformer, and as usual, joined by a guest. This time it's Dr. John West, which many of our listeners will be familiar with. But as I usually ask the guest to do, John, would you please introduce yourself to those people listening that may not know who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm vice president of a group called Discovery Institute, which is sort of a center-right think tank, probably most known for associating with scientists who think there's evidence of design and purpose in nature, people like Stephen Meyer, Michael Behe, many others. I actually co-founded that program. Well, my background is PhD in political science, so I'm sort of on the culture end of the Center for Science and Culture, less than the science. And then before that, and actually, part of the time I was at Discovery, I was a college professor at a historically evangelical Christian university, emphasis on historically. It was in transition while I was there, called Seattle Pacific University. I chaired the Department of Political Science and was there for about 12 years. And I've also been active as an elder in I'm hesitant to say the Presbyterian denominations because one was originally the PCUSA, but I was able to help bring that church out of the PCUSA, so that was good. And then another Presbyterian denomination after that. So I've sort of served at the local church, served at the national level, served in academia. That sort of, I've written books, love C.S. Lewis, so co-edited an encyclopedia for Zondervan many years ago about Lewis. Let's see what else. Do some documentary filmmaking. You can find some of the things on YouTube and elsewhere. So that's sort of a snapshot of who I am.
Excellent. And we'll put in the show notes links to your website and various things you do, so people can go find those without too much effort below. So if you're listening, look below. By the time this is published, there will be links there. But today we wanted to focus specifically on your newest book, which is called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. Which, of course, is a provocative title. People are going to wonder what this means, and of course, what the reason for writing this at this time is. So, please expound on that a bit for us.
Sure. Yeah, it's provocative enough that both Christianity Today and the Gospel Coalition banned ads for the book after accepting them. So,
for our audience, that will be a sign that there's something good.
Keeping seal of approval. Yeah, no, I mentioned it. It was kind of funny and indicative, I think. So, why was it? I think, like many conservative Christians, theologically and also politically, I think we tend to sort of blame the atheists, agnostics, liberals, if you will, for why our culture is going into the sewer. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But the more I have been active in sort of evangelical Christianity, including at leadership levels, the more I was seeing that, in fact, a lot of those same cultural things were being either tolerated or actively facilitated by Christian leaders, pastors, Christians in the media, Christians in politics, Christians in actually science, actually. And so I thought that, we need to sort of get our own house in order. That if you really want the culture to be more healthy, if Christians are themselves aiding in the cultural destruction, then you can't really expect secularists to do anything better than that. And the other part, how I came to Stockholm Syndrome, and just a brief refresher for people, Stockholm Syndrome goes back to an infamous bank robbery in the 1970s in Sweden, where about some bank tellers and bank workers were held hostage for several days. And then something strange happened. At the end of that process, many of the people held hostage actually identified more with the hostage takers and then they did with the police, or, they actually thought these hostage takers were decent young men and they really felt for them. And so out of that came this idea of Stockholm syndrome, where sometimes if you're in an abusive situation, you can end up actually adopting the point of view of your abuser. Now, I should say, I'm not a psychologist. In psychology, this is quite controversial. But what I'm using it for is I think it actually helped describe a mentality that I was seeing both in Christian higher education and more broadly in evangelicalism, where, there are people who are just sellouts and who just curry to the favor of the world. That's true. But I know a number of people who I'd say are personally sincere Christians. They really do believe Jesus is their savior, but they end up mouthing the talking points of people who are very anti-Christian. And the more I investigate, and especially those who are friends and who I know, I do think the Stockholm syndrome really describes where they're at. That, they're personally Christian, but they've spent so much time either in academia or in government surrounded by people who are hostile to a Christian worldview that they end up adopting their operating assumptions. Mm-hmm. And so they end up talking like them and taking their talking points and identify. So, as Christians, we're called to be salt and light to the culture. But these Christians basically are, rather than evangelizing the culture for Christ or Christian truth, they're actually carrying water for the secularist and trying to convince their fellow Christians that that's where they ought to go. So that's sort of the thumbnail sketch of why I wrote the book.
Yeah, so I think would be helpful. There's probably intuitive sense already in what you're saying. Listeners are probably already connecting some of the dots. But give us some illustrative examples of how this plays out, or you've seen it play out, that will put some meat on the bones here.
Yeah. So I talk about a number of different areas. Let's just start quickly with biblical authority, because I think that everything else sort of flows from that. I'm sort of a good Protestant in that way, that if your view of the Bible is low, everything else is going to go wrong. And you have leading evangelical pastors like, say, Andy Stanley. And I'll say one evangelical Christian publisher basically nixed this book. I had an agent who was very well connected, and they nixed it because I criticized Andy Stanley. So that's also part of the story, is that some of these things don't get out because the evangelical establishment, if you will, makes darn sure that they don't get out. So Andy Stanley, large megachurch pastor in Atlanta. The reason why I focused on it in the book is, even as a Presbyterian elder, we were assigned by our pastor to read stuff by Andy Stanley. He actually is a mentor and leader who trains pastors around the world. So it's not just his own megachurch. It's also, he styles himself to training pastors. But what does he actually teach? Well, he wrote a book a few years ago where he called the Old Testament the obsolete testament, and that basically everything evil Christians have ever done is because they rely and believe in the Old Testament. And he actually says it should be, we should reorder our Bibles and move the Old Testament to the back. And just to be clear, he's not talking about Christ fulfilled the Old Testament sacrificial system, something Christians as various as John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas believe. No, he's talking about something a lot more than that. And when you have a leading pastor talking about that, and there are many other things. When I was at a Christian college, there was something that was the rage called open theism, which is that God himself doesn't know the future. Now, whether you're Calvinist or Wesleyan or anything in between, the traditional Christian teaching, which the Bible and Christian tradition is clear on, is God has absolute omniscience about the future as well as the past. And yet I was dealing with kids who would come at me distraught. I mean, I was just a political science professor, and I had to help them find, because they weren't being assigned the more orthodox thing, they were just being propagandized with this new thing, this newfangled thing by our theology faculty. And so, that's biblical authority. But let's get to politics. So in science, the most powerful scientist in America for over a decade was Francis Collins. He was the head of the NIH, just disbursed billions of dollars. So he's the most powerful scientist in America. He was over Anthony Fauci. And he's a self-identified, devout evangelical Christian. And, I can't see in the state of his heart, but I, accept what he says, that he believed Jesus is a savior. But how did he actually lead? Okay, well, here are some of the things he did. He spent millions of our tax dollars on a tissue bank, harvesting aborted baby parts from babies like from 6 weeks to 42 weeks. 42 weeks, it's infanticide. I mean, I think it's killing even at 6 weeks or before, but I mean, 42 weeks, there shouldn't be any discussion. America's leading Christian scientists spent millions of tax dollars to harvest aborted baby parts up to 42 weeks. And to do things like, well, here's one of the research that they funded with our tax dollars, taking the scalps off those little babies and grafting them into mice. And he must have known, I guess, been somewhat uncomfortable because he didn't want it out. The only reason we know what I just said is because Judicial Watch, a sort of conservative watchdog group, after filing public documents request under Freedom of Information Act, they couldn't get it, so they had to sue. And it was only by threat of a judge that Francis Collins devolved over that. But that's not all. Francis Collins also spent millions of more tax dollars funding hospitals and doctors in Boston and LA who were engaged in giving puberty blockers or cutting off the breasts of young women. And he actually pledged publicly that he was an ally and advocate of the LGBTQIA+ and encouraged all of his employees. That's what they needed to be. America's leading Christian scientists. But, this goes back a long ways. I have a bee in my bonnet on this because for those of us at Discovery Institute, we were raising questions about Francis Collins well before he was even before he was at the NIH, because he also is one of the evangelical Christians who has embraced what I would say is unguided Darwinian evolution in a way, and really blasted and attacked other scientists who are Christians who saw that there was evidence of design and purpose in biology. And so he did that. He set up a group called the Biologos Foundation to do that. He also was basically defending eugenic abortions. This was years before he was appointed to the federal government, and no one really was paying attention. He wrote a book called The Language of God, but most people and pastors who were promoting it didn't even really read it, because if they did, they would know in the appendix he actually wasn't willing to say that human life begins at conception. And so, yet I know a number of pro-life people and leaders earlier on, before his record at NIH, thought, oh, Francis Collins, this wonderful person. They were ignoring the record. So that's another example. I'd say, in sexuality, obviously, I mean, we can go into that, and, same-sex, transgender, the number of pastors and Christians, and, even just in the past weeks before we were having this conversation, the Gaineses, Chip and Joanna Gaines, are in hot water, as they should be, for using their platform to basically extol a two-man marriage with kids, where they farmed out, depriving those children of having a mother. But this is, someone, a Christian couple who's made a lot of money in the Christian publishing and Christian market, are actually using that platform to spread something that's really not Christian. And so that's another example. But it's also on the sexuality, I want to say, things didn't start with the breakdown of, say, like same-sex marriage. They started with no-fault divorce. They started with heterosexual breakdown, where many Christians weren't willing to do anything. And one example I talk about in the book is a lady named Hannah Brown, who a few years ago appeared on Bachelorette. It was a year when Bachelorette featured two self-described evangelical Christians. Well, what does she end up doing? She ends up boasting of having a one-night stand with someone on the show. And when people criticized her, she said, oh, well, I can do whatever I want and Jesus still loves me. Well, I think, Jesus does love us, but this is he doesn't love our sin, especially unrepentant sin. But here's the thing. Hannah Brown did not grow up in California or even Seattle, where I'm from. She grew up in the heart of the Bible Belt in Alabama. Houston, we have a problem. If, the people that we're raising who are self-identified evangelical Christians can't even get, the idea of heterosexual monogamy right. And then in the area of religious liberty, I guess I'll just give one more example. So many Christians have, whether it was during COVID but before that, really turned a blind eye to the legitimate religious liberty interest of their fellow Christians. And actually one was Tim Keller, probably the most prominent Presbyterian, more on the theologically conservative side. Some would disagree with that, but I mean, compared to, say, the PCUSA, was definitely, he in New York, you had a lot of churches, ethnic churches, who were renting school facilities after hours, just like any other secular group was allowed to hold church services, because, of course, in Manhattan, it's horrifically expensive. And the school board tried to shut that down. And some of these churches were even founded as offshoots of Tim Keller's Redeemer Presbyterian. But you know who was persona, absent without leave, AWOL in that debate, in defending their religious liberty rights to rent school facilities on the same base as other groups? It was Tim Keller. Now, he was sufficiently embarrassed eventually to put out a statement sort of after the controversy had already erupted, and he was embarrassed. But this is an example of someone who exercised leadership in some areas, but when defending the religious liberty rights of his fellow Christians to meet and worship, he wasn't willing to do squat, really. Other than that, when he was embarrassed publicly by not doing anything, he did issue a statement. Yet, before he died, he was willing to go after that, we are going to be persecuted as Christians, and basically we deserve it because we were not sufficiently loving toward gays or Democrats or on and on and on. And I think there have been Christians who are overly harsh and not loving, and I get that. But that is a smear on the Christian community as a whole. Their problem was not that they were unloving toward gays. It was not that they were unloving toward Democrats. That's just not true. And to blame the victim there is, I think, indicative of this. Again, do I think Tim Keller's in heaven? Yes, I do. Do I think he believed Jesus is Savior? Yes, I do. But he was adopting the point of view of the secularists around him.
Well, and I want to ask more about that in a second, but I think this is, the first example you gave, Andy Stanley, is interesting, but his effective Marcionism is what you're pointing out, which rightly so took a lot of heat when at least one of his sermons articulating this kind of went viral for a bit, right? And I remember in that in that sermon, part of the rationale, he does not present it in that sermon as like this is just an inescapable theological conclusion he's come to on its merit. He talks about if we basically this maneuver is necessary so that we don't lose young people, so that we are acceptable in the culture. Evangelism, of course, is always the label this goes under. And you saw the same thing even more recently when a training and instruction video from his church, he wasn't in the video, but it's from his church, about how to essentially affirm transgender people that might come to your church and how to handle that. And it was the same rationale laid out, that this is in many ways an acceptable way of life, or at least you must be very accommodating of it, so on and so forth. So is that sort of illustrating what you're talking about? Of the question is why? Like, why are Christians capitulating to this outside, perspective that's not indigenous to their own, communities? And it seems to me, at least as a partial explanation, that they're doing it in order to have social capital, to be acceptable, to not be weird, and to have status according to the secular environment.
So I do think with Andy Stanley that a good case can be made for that, and some others. I think it differs. I think some, it really is that they think that they're telling truth to their fellow Christians, so they're being courageous. Because they've so imbibed the operating assumptions that say it's unloving to tell the truth to someone if they're in a destructive behavior. They so imbibe that. But then when you get to someone like Andy Stanley, you're quite right to point out in that sermon, and what I'd like to point out, it wasn't just one sermon. He wrote a book called Irresistible. And so in my book, that's what I spent, because he lays it all out. And you're exactly right that the arguments in that book is that we're going to be an obstacle to the gospel if we don't do this. And actually in the book, he says he thinks the Bible now is basically is indefensible, is not defensible in the public square anymore. And so, but I think even that betrays a buying into the sort of the secular. He's actually accepting the secular indictment and acting as if it's true. So I think even with Andy Stanley, part of it is, yes, we want to be light and winsome and praying, because that's how we're going to spread the gospel. But part of it is they've actually imbibed the talking points of the other side. So I think he actually thinks he's being courageous in telling this truth to his fellow Christians. But yeah, I think this is something I do deal with in the book. It is a mentality that is certainly right. We should not put obstacles in the way of other people coming to the gospel. But the question is, what is an obstacle? If your view of an obstacle is that God himself is an obstacle, because God himself said things that are now, too controversial, and so we have to be God's press agent, in essence, to massage and help people to accept God, then that's hubris. I mean, that's pride. That is not. So it's one thing. We shouldn't let our own sins be an obstacle to people coming to the gospel. Definitely right. But where it's been twisted is they actually cite things where the Bible and the historic Christian tradition, whether it be Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, has been clear, and they say that's the obstacle. Well, at the end of the day, then I have actually a chapter on the sort of infamous slippery slope, and that can be abused as an argument. But I think what is true is if you are a Christian, especially a Christian leader, and you anchor yourself not to the historic Christian tradition and not to the Bible, but to what's acceptable around in the culture. As the culture goes in the sewer down the mountain, you're going to be sliding right along with it and pull along with it because you don't have anything else to stand on. And so I think that's why so many people see the truth in the indictment of the slippery slope, because they see it in people's lives. If you're anchored to nothing more than the existing culture, then as long as the culture, and actually you see this with actually Tim Keller. If you go back before, say, the gay marriage decision of the Supreme Court, he actually signed off on some pretty strong statements defending biblical marriage, because it was, I would argue, more culturally allowable. Once it became less culturally allowable, he became a lot more timid.
Yeah, I mean, if you did it pre-Obergefell, I mean, Obama was even with you for a while, right?
Yeah.
So in New York City, you're just being a good, moderate kind of liberal then. If the phenomenon for Democrats of the past century is affirming, is agreeing with you, you're in good shape in that world. But I do think that same with I remember when Tim Keller died, that there are tons of reflections written on him, many of them perfectly normal and good. But there was the one that got a lot of attention was from whoever the woman was. I'm blanking on her name, but she had been involved in mainstream media forever and had gone to his church many times, right? At least at some point in her life for an extended period of time was there. So had some familiarity with his preaching. And she was not stating it as a negative from her position, because I think she's fairly liberal herself, but as a positive, that she never heard him mention abortion and certainly not preach against it in, however it was, the 2 years she was there, 3 years, whatever, which again, that's why this piece got a lot of attention, because it's like, well, how, especially in a place like New York City, highly populated and highly liberal, this is going on. It is an issue in the culture. How would you possibly never preach against this? And it was like, well, it's even amongst Christians, it's become softened in our opposition to it in many places. So I think it just illustrates, the point you're making of how, and maybe it is just because they're swimming in those waters and not sufficiently resistant to it.
Well, I think that's part of it, but I think even with Tim Keller, if you read his books, as I have, I actually do think he imbibed the worldview. So let's give an example. He wrote a book. This was actually when he was more orthodox than some other things, called Generous Justice on Poverty. Very interesting book. I actually think the biblical parts were okay for the most part, but when he applied it to public policy, it was like the biblical worldview went out the door. Basically, his indictment was the reason we have poverty is it was sort of a quasi-Marxist. I mean, I don't want to bandy that about, but it was because of the structural evil of the capitalist. That was the big thing. And far be it from me, I'm not an apologist for corporate capitalism. I actually think there's a lot of evil that goes on there. But let's get real. If you want to be concerned about long-term, intergenerational, intractable poverty in the United States, redlining, banks, that's not the cause. It's social scientists know it's family breakdown. And this is whether you're black, white, Asian, family breakdown, intact family. So if you really want to deal compassionately with long-term intergenerational poverty, you have to deal with family dissolution and with strengthening traditional families. Yet that was like, you could maybe find a glancing reference to that in the book, but it was like he completely avoided that to offer this bogus, I'd say materialistic interpretation that basically poverty in America is just about resources and not having adequate resources. And that is so far beyond what the Christian tradition teaches, and it's so far beyond reality. So he wanted to speak out on the issue of poverty, but he wasn't willing to really give what I would argue a biblical worldview on that. And the number of Christians who have been active in social service things, who basically have a materialistic worldview, I talk about in my book. When I was a college professor, I would bring in a local pastor who always wore his clerical collar when he was raising funds for his ministry, that helped the homeless in Seattle. But what did they actually do? Well, they helped provide temporary shelter, and that's good. That's fine. But if you're actually a Christian ministry, when students started to ask this person, well, do you try to find out why they're actually homeless? Because homelessness is largely a function in America of not economic breakdown. It's of addiction. It's of family breakdown again. It's of mental illness. And so if you're not actually dealing with that, giving them a temporary shelter for one night, well, yes, that's honorable. Christians should do that. That's not really getting something distinctively Christian, let alone are you willing to offer them, spiritual counsel and stuff. And it became clear that this guy didn't. He actually kind of lampooned the Christian ministries that tried to do some of that. So much of our evangelical Christian superstructure in America is shot through with really adopting the underlying assumptions of the secularist materialist. And I think, that's one reason we're in the mess we are as a culture.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the church, when it's operating that way, or church leaders, I mean, they're barely acting as controlled opposition. They represent on paper that they're different, but their operating logic is the same as what the culture basically expects of them, right? With a sort of Christian veneer over it, but deep down, all the same rationales and same thought processes have already been accepted. And maybe they're just presented in a sort of Christian way, or like where it's relevant to Christians. And I'm sure, it is always, you mentioned this earlier, it's always funny when these, leaders like this, I'm sure they do take on a genuine sort of sense that they're being courageous and a little, and controversial, but they're only that way inside of the little, niche area, the little world of evangelicalism, which is exactly what the culture wants them to be doing, right? They're actually not being courageous at all outside of their congregations, so it just creates internal conflict is all that it's real effectively doing.
Yeah, and this is shot through. It's shot through politics. It's shot through. So I was a college professor for 12 years, and starting in the 90s, when the rage among Christian academics was a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll. Now, the overall thesis, if you don't actually read the book in detail, that evangelicals should be, concerned about intellectual excellence. Exactly right. But if you actually look at how he defined that, it comes pretty close. Well, let me just put it this way. The way it was received by faculty at my university and at other Christian Protestant universities that I know about, it was largely that what is academically excellent is if it's praised by people at Harvard or Princeton or Yale or the New York Times. And I'm sorry, in our current culture, that may be the opposite of it. And now, to Noel's credit, in the original version of his book, he has a little line saying he wasn't just saying that academic excellence wasn't just decided by what the secularists want. But then, just a couple of years ago, he published a new edition. with a new afterword. Boy, I'd encourage people who thought highly of that book to read that new edition, because he basically makes it clear that for him, academic excellence is a set of I'd say leftist ideological ideas. So, if you have a certain view that he disagrees with on Darwinian evolution or on climate change or on, COVID pandemic or on Trump, then you're a Yahoo, know nothing, can't be a serious intellectual. So, in a way, I'm happy that he published it, because I think it made things a lot clearer. But this is sort of, again, this aping of secular culture, or looking to the wrong place. I actually have a chapter on listening to the wrong people, and you see that among academics, Christians, just like you do in other areas.
Maybe especially so with academics, because as you point out, so many of our ostensibly Christian colleges, people wonder why they go a certain way. This is a big part of it. And then academics just, again, because so many evangelicals have a sort of status anxiety because of this kind of thing, they're overly deferential and sort of enamored with those who do have the status, according to, the outside culture. This is what excellence looks like, right? These are the trustworthy people. You already mentioned Francis Collins, same thing operative there. And so then it's like the evangelicals are supposed to, the aspirant elites in evangelicalism are supposed to basically be like prison functionaries for the rest of us, to go around and enforce the rules that are meant to keep you like in captivity, and keep looking to the external standard that sets the tone and the rules for you, and everything else needs to be adjusted, to comport with that. I remember that with Noel's book, thinking broad strokes, even with the thesis, this is doing this for the world, sort of beating up on your own people in front of the rest of the world, is just not a good, effective posture to have if you actually wanted to improve the mind of evangelicals. One way to not do it is to like bully them in public, on behalf of the rest of the world. So anyway, I've never thought highly of Noel's book at all, but it's good to know the appendix bears that out.
Yeah, he understand he wrote that to fellow academics who shared his view. So it was less an indictment. It was an indictment of the unwashed masses, if we say, but it was written in insider speak to people who were very receptive, because they agreed with him, because to them it was an indictment of everyone else,
right?
And so that's it was problematic to begin with, and in fact, if you delve deeply into what he declared was excellent, he attacked the idea of what he called biblicism, which in his view really is following the Bible. To him, it was being loving, which I believe that we are called to do that, but biblical love is not the same as the secular world love, and that's not the be-all, end-all of everything in the Christian tradition. And so his view of what Christian scholarship was not particularly Christian scholarship, if you actually delve into when he discusses that. But you raise a really good question, which I'd like to, so I want, my book does expose and talk about things. There have been other books that do that in different ways. But I think one of the things I can bring to this is I do spend a lot of time on, well, how do we get out of this? And you raise a question that many people are wondering, well, why have our particularly Protestant evangelical Christian colleges, why have they so fallen away in many cases? Not completely true. There are still some solid ones, but many of them have. And I think of my own institution where at Seattle Pacific University, where I was for 12 years, that just a couple of years ago, it was in the national news, not for a good thing, but because over 70% of the faculty and staff voted no confidence in the board because the board wasn't willing to repeal its statement on biblical marriage. And I've asked the question in my book and elsewhere, well, how do you have a Christian institution when over 70% of the faculty and staff are on record opposing biblical marriage? The short answer is you don't have a Christian institution anymore. But in that whole debate, it was instructive. And this was one of the reasons why I wrote the book too, is that a lot of people were saying, oh, the board, it's great because it's not repealing it. But it's the woke faculty. But actually, if that's all you take from it, Christian institutions are going to continue to go down in the sewer, because that's not what happened. And that's not when, especially now I'm talking about Christian higher education. Yes, there are woke professors. Yes, there are, liberal, Bible faculty and things. But the people who enable that are often theologically conservative Christians from business and sometimes even from the sponsoring church who are on the boards. And this is really what happened at Seattle Pacific. So you actually had a board that was AWOL. You have board members who are convinced that their number one goal is fundraising and then cheerleading. Well, I'm sorry. If you're on a board or a board of elders of a local church or a board of a K through 12 Christian school, your number one goal is making sure your institution is faithful to its foundational mission. And if you're not willing to do that, you shouldn't be on the board. And I have to say that my biggest sort of disappointment and my biggest struggle, actually, when I decided to leave Seattle Pacific, I wasn't asked to leave. I had tenure. I just saw sort of the writing on the wall. Why would I spend an institution that is going increasingly, in the wrong direction? My biggest struggle has been dealing with those, in my mind, those board members who themselves, I know who they were. They were biblically orthodox personally. They were not woke. But they made the decisions that basically allowed the institution to be taken over. Yeah. And unlike the people, and in fact, the president at the time who I butted heads with, and if I didn't have tenure, I would have been fired, probably because I opposed some of the things. A few of us did. But the board, was not woke, if you will. That's a sort of more recent, term used. But it was... these biblically orthodox board members were not willing to, they didn't have the courage of their convictions. Whereas, say, the president, who was trying to move things away, he had the courage of his convictions. They may have been wrong convictions. I think they were wrong convictions, but he really fought for what he believed in, and so did the liberal faculty. So I actually, in a way, admire, even though I think they're doing wrong things, that they believed what they were doing, even though it was wrong. And so I don't think it should have been allowed, but they had the courage of their convictions. Whereas these board members who said they had these convictions, and I think they do personally, were not willing, when push came to shove, to actually defend the integrity of the institution. And I have heard that story. I use Seattle Pacific because, and I tell some of the private stories that went on there because I was part of that. But I've seen and heard that at many other Christian institutions. And so when you see a Christian institution that has fallen away, look first and foremost to the board. And if you catch it early enough, eventually the board will reinvent itself, so it will just be filled with theologically heterodox people. But if you catch it in the early enough stages, there might be something you can do. And so one of the reasons I wrote this book is because there were some faithful board members at Seattle Pacific who did try, but they were outvoted. And so I also want to honor that. But part of my book, I actually have a chapter that gives advice for board members of, if you're on a board of either a local church or a Christian school or university, how can you what can you do? And there are lots of things you can do, because a lot of these Christian institutions, the way they fall away, it's under the covers, so to speak. There's never any debate. It's sort of, later you find out too late. If you were one board member, you could force usually a discussion of something. And once you get it discussed, you might be able to get other people on your side, because, and so that's one, way that you can do. There's some other techniques that you can do when you're on a board. And so I do think that training people, Christians from business and other things who are going to be on boards, training them of what it means to be on a board of a Christian institution and how to be effective is so important. There was a lot of emphasis coming out of the 1990s of, Christians should go into all walks of life. I agree with that. But if there are Christians like Francis Collins, you can recruit and place Christians in places of power till the cows come home, and you're not going to get anything different. So you actually have to equip and mentor people who know what they're doing and know how to effectively lead. And I do think that as an evangelical Christian community, we do need to do more on that, of equipping and training people in leadership so they know what courageous and wise leadership is.
Yeah, that sounds very useful for many reasons, what you're doing and talking specifically about these sort of governing and controlling bodies, which applies to basically any institution that we're having problems with or is worth keeping. Because I don't think I would agree. You don't hear much emphasis on that. Of course, it's much more entertaining to talk about the crazy college kids and the woke professors, right? It's much more entertaining, and it gives you the comfort of thinking you've understood the causality. So now we got it figured out. But I think this is it's much more useful sort of analysis of how these things actually work. And I don't know. I mean, how many people are sort of encouraging, we'll use a pastor just to use an example, like how many pastors are sort of encouraging people in their congregations, hey, you need to go out there and get on the board of important institutions so you can control them. That sounds very, that's sort of an awkward thing for most pastors to think that way, or we're averse to it. That sounds strange. It'd be fine if you are on a board, but who's encouraging their people to go and control institutions so that you can save them, and then to sort of, as you're laying out, like aggressively control them. Be a bit of a problem. Go and acquire and then wield power appropriately, right? But that's just something that is not natural for a lot of evangelicals to come to that sort of conclusion and ambition in any sort of prescriptive way. Whereas the left is very happy to do this, right?
And I would say, it's not about power; it's about faithfulness and truth. And God does call people to be in leadership positions. And so I think you do. There is a movement among Christians, for Christian executives and things, and servant leadership, and I get all that. So I do think there's some of that. Mm-hmm. But when they get there, what do you do? It's not biblically faithful to simply rubber stamp. And the number of times, even when I remember when I was on a board and we had this consultant come in and basically tell us, boards, they can set policy, but they shouldn't get into the nitty gritty. And I agree that is, you don't normally necessarily want to do that, but if your institution has a problem, you have to. Mm-hmm. And the way that you actually make sure that your institution is going where it should be is that your board member can't just rely on, say they meet twice a year or 4 times a year and they get a dog and pony show from the administration about how everything great is going. But we have this new fundraising campaign that we'd like you to help with. That's not sufficient. For the institution I was at, if the board members would even just read the student newspaper, they would learn more about what's going on in the classrooms than they probably learn at those board meetings. And so I do think that it's how these people are trained, because a lot of the standard advice out there that I've experienced is like the exact opposite of what you really should be doing. And again, for me, I wouldn't phrase it in terms of power, because I think we're called to serve, but I would faithfulness and truth. Here's where it comes out. When I was at this Christian institution, we had people mortgaging their future, spending money and getting into debt. Because why? They were sold on, well, come here rather than a secular institution so that your son or daughter can integrate their faith with their Christian practice. And so you had really hardworking parents mortgaging their future to send their kids to a place where, as I saw in the 12 years I was there, the marketing got more Christian as what was happening in the classroom got less. And you had kids who would leave with their faith in shambles, and not just because they were undergoing stuff, but because these things were actively facilitated by the culture at the university. And so my talk to the board members, when I have had a chance to talk to various board members, is to point out, who are you really caring for? If you really love those kids, why would you subject them to this? Similarly, one of the most poignant things in the recent controversy at my old school was there was this contingent of hard left LGBTQIA people on the faculty and the students who were trying to take over. And I think many of the board members were led to believe that, well, it's Christian love to just allow them to do whatever they do. But they got a letter from some devout, faithful students who were talking about how hard it was now to be at that institution, because if they gave a more biblical view of God's design for sexuality, they would be shut down in class. They would be belittled. They would be, and so, for board members who think that they're being kind, who are you being kind to? It's not kind to create a situation where the biblically faithful ones are being ridiculed and being berated and not able to get a good Christian education.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so, this false view of love that's out there is one of the most, I think, sinister things, because biblical love, yes, but what passes for love, even in many Christian institutions. I mean, I talk about one point in the book, in a chapter about wisdom, and, growing up in the evangelical subculture, if you will, one talking point I always hear is Christianity is relational. And I agree with that. It is about relationship, a personal relationship with the living God, with Jesus, and with each other. That's true. But it's relationship also with the truth, and it has to go together. And when the relational part is pulled away from the truth part, you get, I talk about in the book, what are two of the most relational institutions in society? Gangs and the mafia, where personal loyalty is everything. But I think most people would recognize that that's really not healthy. And so similarly, Christianity is relational, yes, but that doesn't mean, you ignore things that are bad that are going on, or self-destructive behavior or things like that. And so a false view of love, I think, has really contaminated a lot of evangelical Christian thinking.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. At least for the stated rationale of why certain things are done, right? I think you've already demonstrated, in many ways, it's, at a university or in any institution, they're looking outside of themselves for standards of excellence, for standards of acceptance and status, and so on and so forth. So that, but then to the rationale given, to the people in the pews or wherever, the donors, and it's these sort of Christian, flaky sort of Christian truisms and things, weaponized against everyone. I think you see that all over ministries and institutions at this point, as if it's supposed to, we just, you mentioned the chip and joy and a gains thing, right? There it is. It's active there recently, love is love, judge not, all these sorts of things. So it's, but it's, people wouldn't do it if it wasn't at least partially effective. So it's effective on people. Otherwise you wouldn't see these as defensives, which we can laugh at, but it's like, that's working on a lot of people as they're conditioned for that. And that's another question I had too, is, insofar, let's say, we want to save our institutions. So what we need is for faithful, but also assertive Christians to be on, the boards of these things or whatever. Is there anything about the conditioning you kind of undergo to get to that place, to make it into academia, to be someone that can be hired because you meet the standards of excellence by the broader world? Christian colleges want that too, right? They want the PhD from certain places. They want your CV to look a certain way. And so you could even start out with good intentions, is my point. But part of the conditioning you undergo to get to that place is a lot of what we could. It produces a lot of the types of leaders we're talking about. They may have grown up as a good evangelical teenager and then going off to college, and by the time they're out of their postdoc and through their first job and into something substantial, they've been completely changed because of the waters they're in the whole time.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on, again, who we aim to please, and you're exactly right. Now, I'd say, it differs, but so for Christian institutions like higher education, either from some K through 12 schools, if they're sponsored by an actual church or denomination that appoints many of the members, so that the board isn't self-selecting. I mean, if a board is, I'm going to be brutally honest, if a Christian institution board is self-selecting and it's got into a really bad place, the likelihood that you're going to actually reform that institution is very small. I mean, God can do anything, but it's very small. However, if it's a denominationally sponsored college where the denomination has some role in choosing the board members and the denomination is fairly solid, then becoming active in your church, I mean, there are ways of getting appointed that that may get good people appointed. In other words, so I would encourage people who are in denominations that have sponsored and actually choose board members to, learn about how those board members are chosen. And because often, say, a local conference or synod or what will vote on and even select board members. And so you can actually have a role in that. And I do admit, for my book is not largely written. It's not written to persuade people who are already Stockholm Syndrome Christians. It's written for those who are, trying to be faithful and are distraught and want to understand what's happening and then want to understand what they can do about it. Because, I have one chapter that's like 21 things people can do. And I think, we're not called to bear the weight of the universe on our shoulders. We're not like Atlas. God is in control. God is sovereign. God asks us to be faithful, and God honors that. And I think sometimes even in American evangelicalism, we're so success-driven and do it by financial or numbers of people. Well, we should be faithfulness-driven, and then God can do great things. And if you look historically, when the Christian church was down and out and almost obliterated in many places, how God did amazing things. But he does call us to be faithful. And so I'd say, if you're listening to this, if someone's listening to this and you're overwhelmed, God isn't asking you to do everything, but he is asking you to wisely steward the things he's called you to do. And so let's just say you say, well, I can't be this, now maybe you can advise, maybe you have a friend who is actually a board member who you actually could counsel. But let's just say the number one principle that I'd ask people to think about is do no harm, which is, how are you stewarding the resources you have? Number one is, are you actually connected to a biblically faithful church? Because, and where you're giving your money. I know in the region that I'm at, there was a large megachurch that historically was mostly faithful until its pastor went off the deep end and embraced gay marriage. Too many people stayed at that church who didn't agree with that because, we have friends here, or our small group is here, and they continue to donate money. I'd argue if you're in that situation, you're worse than that pastor. That pastor is misled and is wrong in what he's actually doing, but it's wrong, and then you're continuing to write the check. Similarly, maybe you graduated from a Christian college 20, 30 years ago, and it was faithful then, but it's not anymore. But you write that check every year that you make, and maybe you've even sent your kids there. Well, again, how are you stewarding your own resources? I'd rather have you, I think Christians should be tithing and should be supporting good things, but I'd rather have you not give $1 anywhere if you're giving it to bad things. So at least don't bankroll. So again, how are you stewarding your own things? When it comes to if you're a parent or a grandparent, who's really raising your kids? Now, most Christians say, of course, I'm raising my kids. But is that really the case? I mean, in some of the biblically faithful churches I've been in, the kids, they're not, they're being raised by Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. They're not being Netflix. They're not really being raised by their parents, or the parents are really seeding their grants, or to the public schools, or to bad private schools that are corrupt. There are a lot of Christians say, "Oh, we want our kids to go to the most elite private school," but those end up being very corrupting. And so I think that that's another thing. Who is actually raising your kids? I think we all need to ask that question of ourselves. And then, of course, if you're a board member or if you're a pastor, one other thing that you mentioned that early in this conversation is that often pastors or Christians, what was with I think Tim Keller about the person who attended church who never heard anything about abortion. Well, there's a famous spurious quote. I'm now showing my boomer age. I was the last year of the boomers. Not all of us are terrible. But there was a spurious quote that Francis Schaeffer, whom I really admire and actually dedicate my book to, wrote about, where supposedly it was from Luther, and it wasn't. But it's still, it's right. It's saying that if I proclaim Christ at the one, in all the areas except the area where the devil's really attacking right now, I'm not really proclaiming Christ. Because, and so I'd say in our culture, if the issue in our culture is not that people think that we should not be charitable to people or help them if they're in poverty. I mean, I don't know who's going to debate that, really, but they are going to debate about whether traditional marriage is okay, whether traditional sexual standards are okay. They are going to debate about abortion. They are going to debate about a lot of other things. And if you're only willing to talk about the things that are acceptable, you're not really ultimately preaching the gospel in your culture.
Hmm.
And I think that even though Luther didn't say it, he should have said it.
He should have. Yeah.
It's from a 19th century novel or something. It's a really, that saying is exactly right. And I think for pastors and teachers, you need to think about that are you really teaching the full teaching of what God's word and the Christian tradition teaches? And just to be clear, I actually don't think it's a great idea for pastors to endorse politicians, although I'm fully support the recent determination by the IRS that it's not the government's job to police whether churches endorse, candidates. But I think, you don't, there are dangers you don't want to turn your church into a political convention. That happened on the left, and there are all sorts of dangers that could go into that. Having said that, there's a lot of stuff that don't raise that. I mean, again, abortion primarily is a moral and spiritual issue, regardless of how you think it should be solved with whatever things of legislation. So is marriage. So is that morals are not relative. So is a lot of other things. And so pastors and teachers do have a responsibility of, are they actually teaching the full Christian teaching?
Yeah, I think that's it's 100% right. And if Luther didn't say that, he should have. We don't know if he actually said "Here I stand" either. So we can keep both of these. They're both good quotes and true ones. And I think that's right. I mean, if you're not pressing on, especially the social ills relative to your context, right? I mean, you could you could stand up there on a Sunday tomorrow and preach against burning widows. But you're not in 18th and 19th century India. What's the point of that? And no one's really doing it. And we're in one of the most, I would say, one of the most tolerant and charitable and kind societies and nations in the history of the world. But people get up constantly and are, want to berate people for being too mean and unaccepting and all these things. It's just not. If you have any kind of perspective, it's not the issue. There are other things that are plaguing society. In any case, I think that's a great note to end on, though, with what you were saying. And there's more I'm sure we could talk about and more in the book. It's not all been given away, so the audience knows they still need to go buy it and read it. And we'll put a link to the book in the show notes. Anything you kind of wanted to drop at the end here that maybe we didn't get to, or you wanted to double click on from our discussion, and then we will wrap it up for the day.
Yeah, just that, and we did get into this a little bit at the end, is that although my book is a bit of an indictment, there is a lot there on, well, what can we do? Right down to the level of a local church. And, these isn't rocket science, but it's a lot of things that people are sort of not focused on. And so it's not, if you just don't want to do anything, you probably don't want to read my book, because it is going to give you things that you can do to be faithful, because I think God honors that. And then just the final thing is, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but I want to reemphasize it. If you're distraught, and there's a lot of things to be distraught about in our society and culture, understand that God really can do a great work, and he does all the time. And that, again, we're called to be faithful. But I think of, this is one of the stories I tell in the book, but I tell many more, so you can read it. But, if you were a Christian, say, in China after the missionaries were kicked out, when Mao took over, you may well have thought that, well, that was the end of Christianity in China. But we have very good evidence now that probably the fastest growing faith in China is Christianity, and millions of Christians in China who are very devout. And that, God honored the faithfulness of those who stuck it out. And, we won't always see the benefits of that in this life. And so I'm not preaching health, wealth, gospel, but be encouraged, because we're called to cooperate. I love the verse in Ephesians that talks about God preparing beforehand for the things that he wants us, the good things he wants to do, to walk into. And so we do have a role. But God is working, beforehand actually for things that he is calling us to do. And so be encouraged to be that you're part of that. If you're a faithful Christian, God actually has things that he's prepared for you to walk into that will bring about good for your family, for your local church, for your local community, and ultimately for your nation.
Excellent. Dr. John West has been our guest. Thank you so much for joining us and telling us a bit about your book. Again, we'll have in the show notes all necessary links so people can go find those. And until next time, audience, God bless.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.americanreformer.org or on x.com, formerly Twitter, at @AMReformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at AmericanReformer.org. That's AmericanReformer.org.